Welcome to Seminar 3 of Engaging India at Almedalen, Future Urbanisms. We are coming to you live from Campus Gotland besides the historic Almedalen Park. And behind me, you can see the skyline of Visby inner city, which is so deeply associated with Almedalen Week. This year, Almedalen Week is digital for circumstances that we all find ourselves in and which have been termed as unprecedented in many ways. Perhaps in several other ways, it has also compelled us to look for new approaches towards making connections and also towards together co-thinking sustainability for our planet. And in many other ways, it's also prompted us to accelerate action on creating a new purpose economy. In this seminar of Engaging India at Almedalen Future Urbanisms, our participants are from academia with a deep focus on sustainability and also from the industry who are looking at building ecosystems that facilitate a more inclusive access to the people, a more purpose-driven economy. I would like to now welcome our panelists. Please welcome Professor Ranjula Bali from Stockholm School of Economics, Dr. Raine Isaksson from Uppsala University, Venkatesh Hariharan from the Open Invention Network in India, and also from India, Jojo Mehra from the eGov Foundation. Welcome, and I would like to open the conversation with our understanding of a purpose economy. Perhaps I'm going to leave it to you all to make your introductions, sharing your background and what does and also bringing in the question of what does a purpose economy really mean from your vantage points. Let's start with Professor Ranjula.
Thank you, Rupali, and hello to everyone. Purpose economy is more about, in my understanding, about reaching sustainability and sustainable development, and with that being the focus. So if we go back to today's topic of discussion in terms of sustainable development goals and Industry 4.0, let me just begin by giving a broad setup and then move on to all the other speakers. But I don't know how I should do, Rupali. Do you want me to
go ahead, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So beginning from the mechanized production that took place in Industry 1.0 with the steam engines and moving on to mass production that was made possible with the assembly lines and electricity in Industry 2.0 to Industry 3.0 with automation, IT, and electronics. And then finally to Industry 4.0 in terms of connectivity, in terms of smart technologies, cloud computing, big data, networked machines and processes. Industry 4.0 is about bringing in research and innovation to transition towards sustainable, human-centric, and resilient industry. And in other words, that's my understanding of purpose economy. But I think that the purpose economy connects even more to Industry 5.0, which is about moving beyond efficiency and productivity and reinforcing the role and contribution of industry to the society. And that in terms of both preservation of resources, climate change, but also social stability. So social stability itself includes what we have been discussing about in terms of, what we hard code equalities would be a part of that. When we discuss about sustainable development goals and Industry 4.0, I'll make 5 key points that come out of my research, but also I think are important, not just for India and Sweden, but any developed country in the world. Number 1 is that sustainable development is inclusive of economic development and growth. And that's a point, I think, when you hear politicians, whether they're presidents, prime ministers, finance ministers of different countries in the world, when they talk about sustainable development, they say we believe in sustainable development and preserving the environment, but we need to take care of the poverty in our countries and economic growth. I would like to emphasize that these are not two different things. sustainable development is inclusive of economic growth. True that there are inconsistencies and conflicts within the concept of sustainable development. But it is inclusive of economic, environment, and social development. That's my first point. Point number two is sustainable development goals are multidimensional. They are universal. They include 17 different goals, 169 sub-targets, 332 indicators. 100,000 experts from around the world got together and created these goals. But policies targeting sustainable development goals are not a zero-sum trade-off. You have trade-offs, you have synergies, there are interlinkages, right? So when we talk about sustainable development goals, industry and innovation, in terms of SDG 9, there are going to be some trade-offs and some synergies with other goals, whether it's goal number 8 in terms of growth and employment, or in terms of poverty, in terms of quality, SDG 10, for instance, sustainable development goal number 12, sustainable consumption and production, sustainable goal number 13 in terms of climate change. So to be able to deal with trade-offs, we need to have transition. We are going to have transition costs. So we need to make resources available for that kind of transition to be made possible in more seamless way. If I'm not taking too much time, I'll go on quickly with 3 more points. And then we can go into more detail later on if there are questions. Number 3 is that today's globalized world has long value chains. So it's impossible to talk about textile consumption and production in European Union and then ignore the fact that 80% of the emissions and the impact on the environment takes place outside the EU. And then the 4th point I want to make is that with innovation and research, we can make this transition into circular manufacturing systems. But then, of course, there are concerns in terms of infrastructure availability, impact on employment, and so on. And finally, as I said, trade-off is not a zero-sum game. So we need to prioritize SDGs. And the way we do the movement towards, Industry 4.0 in Sweden is going to be different from the move that we do in India, for instance. And so there is learning that can take place, but there are also innovative new paths that need to be taken to make that transition. Thank you, Rupali.
Yeah, I'm going to thanks, Dr. Rajula, and I'm going to pass the baton to Venkatesh. You did speak about, the digital transformation and technology and innovation. Connecting that to a purpose economy, Venkatesh, what does it really mean to you?
So my interest has been in democratizing access to knowledge and technology, and that's what drew me to the open source community in the year 2000. Subsequently, I think in the last few years, one of the concerns I have had is the tremendous, increasing inequality between the rich and the poor. And one of the causal factors is the enormous power of digital platforms. And if you look at what has happened, you have had the open internet. And then, on top of that, because of network effects, you have had large platforms who have come up and become massive monopolies. So I've been interested in seeing how we can create some countervailing force. I've also spent about 15 years in public policy, working with Google and others. And the policy response to these kind of issues is also something that is of great interest. So at the intersection of technology, policy, and society, how can we build a more equitable and just society where we see the benefits of technology flow more equitably, where the concentration of digital power is balanced. And I think what's happening in India probably has tremendous lessons for the rest of the world, especially the emerging economies of Africa and other parts of the world. in India, we've been building out something called the India Stack, which is basically digital infrastructure for identity, payments, and data. I've especially worked a lot on the identity, the payments layer and the identity layer. Recently wrote a paper on digital sovereignty and payments. And I think what we have done in India is build digital public goods and build infrastructure as public digital infrastructure. So the unified payment infrastructure is a good example of that. So globally, if you look at it, payments is a duopoly, whether it's a MasterCard and a Visa, or you look at Alipay and WeChat. In India, we have ensured that by building public digital infrastructure called the unified payment interface, nobody can build a monopoly on the basis of network effect. I think that's a very, very important thing. As other countries look at building out their own digital infrastructure, this will be enormously beneficial, because you now have infrastructure which is built and managed by the government, and you have private players playing on top of it. And this brings me to maybe the final point which I want to say here. It will be very difficult for a government which is analog to govern a digital society. So unless and until governments get into the game of building public digital infrastructure, it's going to be a really, really big challenge. The advantage of building public digital infrastructure is that you can enable policy goals like financial inclusion, greater innovation, and UPI is a great example of it. So let me just stop there. Maybe I can explain if time permits.
Sure, we have an hour, so I think there is enough time. Though it usually happens that in seminars, the last 10 minutes, we are like scrambling to ask a lot more questions. But the linkage of what you are saying is also connected with what you work with, Jojo. A purpose economy, in some sense, is also about equitable access to information and services. Now, as someone who has been in that digital space, and now working with creating digital public goods for solving these urban complex problems, what's the kind of innovation that's coming about with the EGA Foundation, and how does it connect with the purpose economy?
Thanks, Rupali. Yeah, that's true. It in fact leads in quite well to what Venkatesh was saying. Just a quick background. So EGA Foundation was set up in 2003 by Nandan Nelikani, the co-founder of Infosys, and also by Shrikant Nadumuni, who's the ex-CTO of Aadhaar. That's the unified ID system of India. We are set up as a non-profit, and we are on the mission to catalyze urban transformation by creating open digital infrastructure and an ecosystem around it. From our perspective, we work with governments, so we work with about 2,400 urban local bodies, who use the digital platform. That's the digital infrastructure for governance, impact, and transformation. That's the digital platform. For context, India has about 4,400 urban local bodies. The digital platform itself makes sure that it's easy to provide access to services that are built on it, right? So services that are used by people around things like your water connections, the payment of your municipal taxes, trade licenses. And it's not just by citizens, but it's looking at the entire system itself, or even resolving public grievance systems. And to date, we would have impacted about 150 million citizens. Having a platform like Digit, right, that's being used by hundreds of urban local bodies, gives us the ability to quickly develop solutions and roll them out to scale. And that's what provides access to the last mile to citizens across the length and breadth of the country, where we're trying to ensure that the benefits of digital transformation are not just enjoyed by a few, but they're rolled out across the country at population scale. So that's what we're working on.
And I'm going to get Dr. Raine also in this conversation. Dr. Raine, we have touched upon quite a bit of how India is working on on digital technology, on Industry 4.0, and towards building a purpose economy. It would be very interesting to hear your context and your point of view from Scandinavia and Sweden particularly.
Thank you very much, Rupali. This morning we heard about this cooperation requiring that we are able to have a dance between elephants and ants. Us here in small Visby, as I am being the ants, I feel like a very small ant because really, to be honest, the purpose economy term, I see it for the first time today. So a few words about my background, just to try to explain where I'm coming from, and then maybe a trial to answer the question is that I have something like 20 years in industry behind me, and I've basically worked with cement production. I worked 10 years in Africa in different African countries, and then I've been about 20 years in academy. So I'm a chemical engineer, but then I did my PhD in quality management. And when I started my PhD quite late, I had this question: why is it so difficult to improve? Now, 20 years have passed and I still ask the same question, but it comes more specifically, why is it so difficult to make sustainable development happen? And just recently got down to maybe to some of the details, which I think reflect to what some of your others has. I think Ranjula brought up this with the focus on looking at the value chain. And it's dawned upon me in work. I've got a new PhD student who looks at sustainable building, the entire value chain of sustainable building. And the problem is that it seems quite simple when you say, okay, but how do we actually define what it is? And that's where quality management, I think, might help. So from the principles, practices, and tools, the principle of focusing on customer needs, when we enlarge it to focus on stakeholder needs, and when we then see the final stakeholders as humanity and nature, that is people and planet, then it starts to be a little more clear. So we go back to like sustainable building. So who are then the main, well, I mean, people. Obviously, sustainable building needs to be affordable, otherwise, but it also needs to be climate neutral. And when we take this back and we look at the sustainability reports of leading Swedish companies within the building industry, we realize that nobody has actually even made a tentative to define what they mean by sustainable building, which then becomes a big problem, because how could we lead change towards sustainable development, even if we don't, in a simple issue as providing us with dwellings, do not agree on what sustainable development is. So I think the purpose economy here is really to look at the stakeholder needs, where obviously humanity would be in focus, but then safeguarding the planet so that future generations also can provide for their needs. So I think we need to go back and try to, for every business we're doing, try to understand what do we really mean, because if we don't agree on that, it will be very difficult to lead sustainable development. Thanks.
That's an interesting point, Dr. Raine, and I will ask that question to you perhaps a little later on. Is there a common approach really to measure sustainability? Because the context matters, where we are in, say, the economic development scale matters. But I'd like to come back now to Professor Ranjula and also get an economist and an academic point of view on this. You have really been at the forefront of interdisciplinary research on sustainability. However, you're also an economist by training. Now, for a purpose economy to truly take shape, how important are public goods and digital public goods as enablers, especially when one is trying to achieve the sustainable development goals?
Public goods and digital public goods are obviously, I mean, if we just look at the current crisis that we are dealing with, I mean, it by itself, explains the importance of public goods and infrastructure. I mean, just look at the health sector and the investment that needs to go into the health sector. So of course, that's going to be at the, it touches and goes beyond like at several levels. If we don't have good health, good education, just the very basics. Of course, and if we look at the education and we look at the availability of the digital infrastructure right now, it's so important with the COVID pandemic, with the schools closed. You can't even function, the students cannot even function without that. So, of course, it's central to the existence of, and especially when we are already speaking about the impact on the inequality. I mean, the difference in terms of, and you see that already in terms of education, in terms of students. We've heard about children taking their lives because they didn't have access to a cell phone and they couldn't get access to their online classes. So without doubt, it is at the very base of building on and achieving towards sustainable development. But if I can also put on my economist hat and talk about sustainable development and industry, I would like to emphasize that sustainable development is not just good, it's also smart. And we demonstrate that with our research. In fact, we have a collaborative research with the Stern Business School in the New York University. And we have looked at the textile sector. And we are working on demonstrating that, in fact, if you undertake sustainable practices and processes all along the value chain, you in fact end up with greater profitability as well. In fact, I have some figures for another industry, the meat industry in Brazil. And this was partnering with McDonald's, our collaborators at Stern Business School. They studied the meat industry in Brazil. And they demonstrate that sustainable production is also profitable production. So not just in terms of the public sector, the private sector, the industry can also make this move and also be profitable. And so in this example, for instance, for the meat industry, the ranches, they experienced dramatic improvements in their productivity and they gained new market opportunities. And in fact, they increased the profitability by about 6.8%, 6.8 times their original profitability. As we move up the supply chain, slaughterhouses, for instance, in the meat industry, they made a potential economic net benefit of about $65 to $307 million by moving towards sustainable practices. And retailers, when they move towards sustainable practices, they gain from protection of their reputation, and they got a way of capturing new markets. And so their potential gains were calculated up to about 15 to 78 million US dollars. So what we have tried to, and we are also trying to show that for the textile industry. So I would say that both the public sector and private sector, as they move towards sustainability, they are going to reap the benefits of sustainable development. And so we discussed, I think Ren mentioned some of the challenges that the industry faces in terms of, and of course those challenges exist, but there are these pull factors in terms of the enormous profits and gains that can be made both in the public and private sector in terms of achieving more sustainable development and sustainable development goals as well.
Venkatesh, picking up from where Dr. Ranjula has left, coming to this whole issue of sustainable development goals, from your perspective, is it only about, at the end of the day, how sustainable you are? Is it also linked to, as far as businesses go, to profitability, or is it also important to bring in the whole concept of public digital goods with public as the entry point?
So I prefer the term public digital infrastructure to other terms because I think we have to design these things with the long-term interests of individuals at heart. And I think the way unified payment interface was designed is a good example of that. As an individual, if I'm using UPI, I can choose from any of 200 different banks, and I can download those apps and make a payment to anyone else on that network. And there is a policy goal. There is also an individual choice goal that is served through this kind of a infrastructure. And I think it's a great case study for the design and deployment of public digital infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So at an individual level, I get a variety of choice. I get an interoperable payment network. I get enormous amount of convenience. If I am a merchant accepting payment on UPI, I get the payment immediately. My transaction rates are low. And if I am the government implementing this kind of a system, I am able to enforce interoperability because and policy goals. If a policy goal is that we need to create digital alternatives to cash, then you have to have interoperability, because otherwise you have multiple closed loop networks and I can pay to you as long as we are on the same network. So there are multiple goals that get served. The final goal is that because everybody is building on top of this platform, you can encourage greater amount of competition instead of having an ecosystem where there are two duopoly or monopolistic players that I need to then negotiate with. So, so the power dynamics of what is being implemented through public digital infrastructure, I think, is extremely powerful.
And Rainer, from your perspective, one of the questions really, and I think you touched upon that when we came to you first, is that how do you really measure what is sustainable really, and does it depend on the context? Does it depend on where you start from? What's the starting point of measuring sustainability? And you gave an interesting example of trying to measure sustainability when it came to the, say, cement industry or buildings or infrastructure, but even at a larger context of all the SDGs, where does one really get started? Because industry covers various facets, right? And when we are talking about sustainability, it is about industry, it's about government, it's about policy, it's about people, it's about interoperability, it's about nations coming together. So how can it really be measured that everyone understands or there is a common understanding of sustainability and sustainable development goals?
It's a very good question. I think there are always going to be different models of understanding. What I believe is that if we go from this outside-in perspective that basically is coming from the quality principles, so where we look at those that are in need, and we all know about the triple bottom line, but the argument there is that really it is people and planet that are in focus, and profit is a means to an end. So those companies that really can provide the best value for people without having too much of a harm or impact on nature, on planet, will be those that will be successful and that will drive prosperity. So I mean, when you look at basic needs like food or transport or housing, then where I've worked is housing, and I worked very early in the value chain with cement production. But if we and when we look at different systems to measure sustainability, there are many of them, but they are all based on that you have 100 indicators that you add together. A good house has good ventilation, good light, this and that. And then you add that together and so you 79 on the sustainability scale, and you ask, so is this sustainable or not from a planet perspective or from a people perspective? And that's where we've gone from the other side and said, look, we use the Pareto principle. We'll take those vital few things. So everybody needs a house. So affordability is for the people part, the number one thing. And for planet, we know that climate change is one of the huge issues. And I think Tove Roström earlier said that that the building value chain is responsible for something like 40% of the energy production, which actually is the same then. 40% of global carbon emissions comes from building. So there we have our Pareto harm, the climate. So affordable or sustainable building is affordable, zero carbon footprint. Then you go to the different companies. So when I go back to my cement plant there, then I start looking, so what would this translate into? Well, the gray powder, which makes concrete, which makes houses, the cement is the glue. So the more it can glue, so the stronger it is, and the lower its carbon footprint is, the more value it produces per harm. And then I can break it down to different parts. So our approach currently is that we'll think that all companies need to somehow place them in the value chain where they are, and then try to understand what that value chain, the sustainability in it is, and then to translate it to your own definition. It will not be perfect, but I think a bad definition is better than no definition, because I can hear this all over the place. I've been involved in sustainable tourism, and it's a research school here. And I brought up the issue, and people say, but it's too hard. So let's just go to the next step. So if we haven't understood or agreed upon what sustainable tourism is, it will be very hard, I think, to work towards it. So I think we need to go back to trying to have a common understanding, the best kind of a common denominator that we could have. That's our working plan for the moment.
Dr. Angela, would you like to add a bit here, given your academic perspective on sustainability and sort of measuring what really sustainability is?
Well, we have global definitions, and general definitions, but it doesn't work when it comes to industry and more specific industries. So, there is always going to be that challenge in terms of, especially when it comes to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, in terms of interpreting them at different regions, different industries, and then at the corporation level. So, as Ryan said, it requires more work in terms of understanding breaking down the whole value chain into different processes. And one way, at least for the industry, the way we have done in our project when we looked at the textile industry, was to specifically look at the cost reduction that comes in the textile industry from saving energy, chemicals, and water. And then in terms of looking at the revenue increases, in terms of looking at the risk avoidance, and then kind of other benefits or losses from kind of undertaking the sustainable practices and processes. And then once you get them physically, then to monetize them. So use certain kind of discount rates or prices, and then put a value, a financial value on it to kind of understand whether, how it's working. So it's very hard to use the Sustainable Development Goals as they are specified by the UN and to implement them. So it has to be done more specifically at the industry and at the firm or the corporation level.
Right. I'm going to now shift it a little bit on another aspect, another perspective to sustainability, and that is about access to information and access to services. Jojo, if I can bring you here, how can we really design an hardcore equity from the perspective of digital democracy and socioeconomic growth? Because that is a key factor when we are talking about sustainability at a larger level.
That's a good point on looking at access and looking at how do you make sure that there is equity in the entire system itself. I can share a little bit about how we think about these issues from a digital perspective when we're working on digital platforms, right? So when we're thinking about any digital intervention, I think it's imperative that we get the view from all stakeholders and co-create solutions with them. From a platform perspective, some things like say privacy, security, access, need to be baked into the design of the platform itself. These are not appendages that are added later. These are context invariant, right, and should always be adhered to. So these are the principles that Dr. Raine was referring to. How do you look at access right in the design of the platform itself? As we move closer to contextual solutions that are built on the platform, we need to allow for these solutions to be customized, to be reconfigured. They need to be evolvable over time, over space, such that they can address localized problems. Ultimately, these interventions will work only if they're adopted by people. So we think about this access and adoption of digital solutions across 3 axes, right? We think about how can we deepen impact, and that's increasing impact by making them inclusive from simple things, right? How do you make them easy to use? How do you simplify it? How do you look at improving the access to multiple channels? The second axis that we look at is how do we widen this impact, and that is really about increasing the geographic reach, right? So if you're having a digital solution, if you have a platform, can it go to the last mile? Can it go beyond just the areas that have the privilege of digital access? So something like this, for example, we worked on where we realized that there is a role that intermediation of digital platforms has a role to play in this, right? And then how do you factor for intermediation at a population scale when you're working on digital platforms? The third one that we look at, the third axis that we look at is extending this impact, right? And this is through the number of products and services that can be customized, that can be built, that can be extended by partners, by the entire ecosystem, and making them available to people based on their need at that point in time, right? So that's how we think about access and adoption. That's through deepening, widening, and extending this impact.
Venkatesh, would you want to add something here?
Yeah. So since I come from the policy world, the way I look at it is, I think there is a need for futures thinking. We need to really start thinking of 10 years down the line, what does society look like? What does, say, education look like? And the trend that everybody agrees on is that it will be increasingly digital. Therefore, we have to then look at, what are the barriers to going digital? And in India, there are multiple barriers. Access to devices is a big problem. Access to the internet is a big problem. Even if you have devices and the internet, most of these devices are in English. So can we enable access in, the 22 official Indian languages? That's again a massive problem. And again, these are areas where the government really needs to step in. And the solutions could be that you incentivize, mass production of devices, and maybe, even make that a part of, say, the direct benefit transfer to the poorest people parts of our society. And that would, to some extent, address the problem that Professor Ranjula mentioned about, students not being able to, access online education. So can we also look at tools like satellite internet to provide access to people in remote parts of the world? And, at a larger level, how can we enable Indian language computing by default in all the computing devices that are shipped out in India? So I think it requires a lot of full spectrum thinking, long-term thinking, and then, working backwards from that future that we visualize. Let me stop there.
Right. And what you and Jojo are talking about and what you all do is really at a ground level. It is digital, but you all are building an ecosystem. Now, how can we align that, say, with academia? Maybe I will put that question to both Dr. Ranjula as well as Dr. Raine. Who would like to go first? Perhaps you, Dr. Ranjula?
I was hoping you would move to Ryan.
Okay, Dr. Raine, let's start with you.
No, but I can just I'll say a small. I just wanted to make a small point connected to what Jojo and Venkatesh were saying. I think one example that demonstrates something that both of them were mentioning is the CoWIN app the app that is used for, giving the COVID vaccination in India, and some of the points that, you mentioned in terms of access to devices, internet, language. And I would also add, like, the human capital that is resident within the population. That's another major, and then cultural problems in terms of the uptake of such services. Though those kind of things are also very important. I mean, the socio-cultural milieu in terms of adapting these technologies is also going to be a challenge. And we see that already with this COVID app, where every citizen has the right to get a COVID-19 vaccine, but has to register online and use these services. So with that, let me just shift the weighting to Ryan. Ryan?
Thanks. Well, I think it's great with the development of the digital infrastructure. And let me just briefly say, I was as a volunteer in Tanzania in the middle of '80s, and I had to go to Central Dar es Salaam to order a call, which went through, I think, 3 switchboards and things. And so the ordinary communication was by letter, which took 3 weeks each way. And flights were expensive, so you stayed for 2 years there without. Today, we had recently a Zoom meeting with people from Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, and Sweden, which worked more or less okay. So it suddenly opens up enormous possibilities for us to communicate both with university and then with actors, which are business actors. And I think if it were Venkatesh who mentioned the enormous challenges in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, India has big challenges, but still sub-Saharan Africa maybe is the poorest part of the world. But where these digital services start to be available, which would then enable educated youngsters, and there are a lot of university-educated young people without work, somehow getting involved, because now if just the digital solution works, if you have internet access, then you can join. And I think here, my last point is that I hope now Uppsala University is waking up for their responsibility to do something. Cooperation like with Africa earlier has been, well, it's not so interesting because there are not so many good universities. Instead, it would be like, which universities could we support and help with, and how could we get into it? And maybe this could be a cooperation between Sweden, India, and sub-Saharan Africa, because in many cases, India has the more practical solutions to those problems that you find in countries like Tanzania, whereas Sweden might be a bit too expensive in many ways.
That's an interesting offer, and I hope that those who are hearing you as well, Dr. Reiner, will take you up on the offer of this whole collaboration and cooperation between Sweden and India and other places to actually improve the digital systems, improve digital public infrastructure, as Venkatesh put it, digital public goods, as Joja has been putting it. And also another important point is, how do we get in the private sector when we are talking about enabling an entire population really to move to the next level of access. Professor Ranjula, I think you raised your hand. I did see for a moment. Would you like to add something here?
Yeah, I wanted to say that, when we Ryan talked about Africa, if we look at East Africa, for instance, and several parts of the world, actually, both in Asia, also South America, digital financial services have been one area that have taken that have been able to use these technologies and services to their advantage. So go back to the connectivity in East Africa, for instance, let's say about 2 decades back. And with the arrival of mobile phone, the financial services, and at the very, very, low income household level, has kind of taken off like anything. So the digital technologies have also kind of showed enormous growth and utility for low-income households in various parts of the world. So I'm thinking about microfinance institutions using mobile phones, both in terms of the security and provision of small loans that become very difficult, or very expensive to service administratively. So it brings down the cost to the industry, improves the security situation, and so on. So financial security, financial industry, I think, is one industry that has been able to harness the power of digital services pretty well.
That's true. In fact, Venkatesh, if I can bring you in, your current focus is also on the overall financial payment ecosystem and architecture, right? And in your previous avatars, you have been at the forefront of evolving iStack, also which underpins much of what India's open source digital financial backbone really is. Now, if you were giving an open canvas, how would you evolve a similar backbone, say, for sustainable finance, and which also involves both the private sector apart from the public sector or the government?
So I would say that the best way to evolve it is that the government has a role to play in building infrastructure. And frankly, when it comes to digital infrastructure, for historical reasons, the governments around the world have abdicated their responsibility. I mean, when it comes to building physical infrastructure, it's well understood that it is the government that builds the roads and the private sector that builds the cars. You don't see a situation where the private sector is building the roads, except for toll roads, and the government is building the cars. So here in digital, we have a system where, we imagine that everything will be built by the private sector. I think it's time for the government to reimagine its own role in the digital world. And there are two parts to it. One is the legal part of it, where you really rethink, competition law and other legal frameworks required to govern these ecosystems. And the second is, what kind of technologies do you bring? And I think this is where, tremendous amount of work needs to be done. But if I were to go to Rwanda and implement something like this, think of the fact that from a financial inclusion perspective, almost 95% of Rwanda is small and medium enterprises. What that means is that these people do not have collateral to offer. And today, most of the banking system is collateral driven, but they have cash flows. The problem is that you cannot trace their cash flows because these are all, hard currency, paper notes. But if these transactions were to be digital, if I as a lending institution had a way of tracking their transactions, if I know that the predictability of income is X, the profitability is Y, then I can say that, I can securitize your next 2 years of income and give you a loan of X percentage. So I think to me, that is the massive new opportunity that is going to come in. And what that means is that governments will have to build payment infrastructure, they will have to build data infrastructure, and underpinning everything is identity. Unless and until I can ensure that, you are indeed the Rupali you claim to be, I cannot have any mechanism of recovering that money from you. So identity, payment, and data is public digital infrastructure. And, public lender, the private sector lenders, etc., building on top of that. I think that's the way I would imagine the future of, let's say, financial inclusion to be.
Right. Interesting. I'm going to put that out to you as well, Jojo. You've had an interesting journey from being one of the early movers in the digital space, working with cutting edge companies on digital media in UK, also being an entrepreneur in the digital space, and then being a part of, or you're working, sort of studying digital governance from the Estonia perspective. Now, as someone who's been at that intersection of emerging digital technologies from a European perspective as well as from India, now how do you see it contributing to a more stronger, really, digital backbone for India? And what are the differences really that you see from a European perspective vis-a-vis the India perspective, which you are working with now?
So in terms of the principles, especially when you're building digital goods, there are lots of commonalities, right? The one thing that strikes you as different is obviously scale. right? And just the diversity that India offers across everything, right? And building these platforms and bringing about systemic change is complex, right? Because while technology is an incredible force multiplier to solve these problems and create impact, it is ultimately an enabler. At the core of it, technology is going to accentuate the underlying characteristics of your system, right? So if your system itself is lopsided, technology will just hasten that process. So you've got to be mindful about how you bring the building blocks together. This is something that Venkatesh spoke about, right? How do you make sure that at the core of it, the building blocks can be configured, can be reconfigured, such that it takes away the lopsidedness of the existing system. And also, when you're building these platforms at scale, you've got to be mindful of some key challenges and considerations. For example, a one-size-fits-all approach does not work in India, right? That's something that we've learned over and over again. It's not about producing a technology artifact and deploying it to a problem, right? We've seen that fail over and over again. Like, for example, in India, you would have different states, different cities. Each of them would be at different levels of digital maturity. Each of them would have different priorities, different needs, different budgets, different capacities on how soon or how extensively they can execute a program, right? We've also got to be mindful that, a country like India, again, has a federated governance structure. So that you need to build the right controls at the right levels and factor in autonomy and flexibility at each stage. I've spoken about siloed solutions, right? So it's not just about a monolithic architecture, but it's also about silos. You need to break silos. And we're doing some very interesting work, in fact, on the public finance space in this. If there is any sector of the government, any segment of the government that is sufficiently advanced in its digital adoption, in India at least, it is the financial space. But that comes with its own problems, that there are way too many solutions, way too many financial systems, and they all are pipelines. So while the pipelines in themselves are very, very efficient, they don't necessarily talk to each other. The data within them is not talking to each other, and hence, how do you solve for that, right? But I think I would rest with saying that in India, I think what is also heartening, while I completely agree with Venkatesh that this is the responsibility of the government to really build a public digital infrastructure, I think it's heartening to see that the entire ecosystem is coming together in the work that Venkatesh is doing at iSpirit, right? And some, people who've built out Aadhaar, people who've built out the India stack. There's a clear realization that we can't do this alone. If you want to have sustainable impact at scale, we need to tap into the collective energy of the entire ecosystem. In the in our context, in the societal platform context, we call it Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar, which we bring all three together. Samaj is the people, is the citizens, the civil society, research, academia. Sarkar is your government. And Bazaar is the market players of the market of private players, right? You've got to get all of them together to build and solve these problems at scale.
It's interesting that you talk about Samaj, Sarkar and Bazaar, because in Sweden, there is a similar model. And Rainer, perhaps you and Ranjula are well aware of that, is that I've heard here is the triple helix model of having the government, academia and industry look for innovative ways and work on innovation and sustainability. Rainer, if I can get back to sort of the academic lens, Jojo spoke about building blocks when we are talking about Industry 4.0, when we are talking about digital public goods, when we are talking about building really the next generation systems for the people and planet. How can the academia contribute to this?
Well, I think academy, and I think it's been notified by Uppsala University in their new goals, where the relevance is brought up that earlier it was world-class research, now it is relevant world-class research. So my a bit evil observation was that it seems that university finally has realized that they have some customers, they are producing value to somebody else, and this comes both then in research and in education. And here in Visby, in Campus Scotland, where I am, we have now an agreement with Campus Scotland and the region of Gotland to try to cooperate, and the word living lab has been mentioned to see how we actually together can work. And it's, I mean, even if everybody is agreeing that this is important, it's not always so easy. So here, just very recently, the region launched a regional development strategy, our Gotland in 2040. Mm-hmm. And one way forward is to see how can we join forces here in somehow supporting region Gotland and the island of Gotland towards sustainability, then working together with both public but also private businesses. But it is a challenge, and it goes a little bit. It contradicts the logic of the academy, whereas one of my bosses put it, look, researchers decide what they research, and what we research in, that we teach. Now, that is the ultimate inside-out approach, and we need to change it towards, okay, so what is the societal sustainability actually requiring, and then see how we can help them achieve that. So I think it looks promising.
Very interesting. Dr. Anjula, would you like to add to what Raine has said on, bringing in the academia, bringing in the market, bringing in government, working together for really the next, whether it is Industry 4.0, 5.0, the people, planet, all together towards sustainability?
Yeah. I think as far as the research and innovation is concerned, the academia and its research has done a pretty good job of providing innovative, there are areas in which we need to continue working, whether it, specifically in terms of batteries or, certain kinds of technologies, renewable energy and so on. But in addition to that, we also need to identify and use the research that is in the field of social science, for instance. It's not just about having the scientific technology and the innovations. It needs to be adapted to the market. It needs to be accepted in the society. I mean, things like Venkatesh and Jojo were also mentioning about. So to be able to do that, research in social science is important, economics is important, management is important, sociology is important, but also cultural studies are important to be able to understand how the societies are going to uptake these kind of new technologies. And I think that has been kind of neglected. And a lot of research efforts have been just into, understanding that, climate change, it is important to understand that, yes, climate change is happening and to have the scientific evidence for it. But it's equally important for people to accept that, and for understanding why, if people are skeptical, they are not, what are the factors that are feeding into that. So in addition to all that and all different kinds of research that feeds into that direction, what we also require is critical thinking, thinking into the future, and also kind of coming up with solutions that would help scalability. And that I think is important. And as an academic, for instance, I think it's one important elephant in the room is the fact that financial resources are important for addressing the sustainable development goals. We need 7 to 10% of the global GDP. We need 25 to 40% of the annual global investments, and they have to come from somewhere. So an academic will point that. A politician would kind of avoid that question, right? So we need to have those kind of investments to enable sustainable development goals. And to be able to achieve that, it's not just the public sector that has an important role to play, it's also the private sector that has an important role to play. So academics are sort of fearless in pointing these things out.
That's interesting, and I'm glad that you have put all three together. It's the public sector, it's the private sector as well that has an important role to play, and the academia. And of course, then what comes into play are other layers like the cultural context and how whether we need to also do a cultural shift in how we view life as it is today, how we view mobility, how we view our cities, how we view our urban environments, and whether Industry 4.0 is only about technological innovations, or does it require a shift at a multiple level? I think we are kind of running out of time, so I wanted to ask you all this question, but perhaps I'll leave it with that question. Thank you so much, Venkatesh, Dr. Ranjula, Dr. Raine, and Jojo for joining us on this very engaging conversation at Engaging India at Almedalen Week. Future Urbanisms. I hope we can indulge in more such conversations even beyond Almedalen Week. But for now, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you all here.
Thank you, Rupali. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rupali. Should we log off now?